It's Monday. That means it's time to talk about the box office with Mr. Dan Murrell. And man, The Meg is chomping through the charts today, Dan.
The Meg is one of those movies we've talked about tracking on this show. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's accurate, sometimes it's not. The tracking on The Meg was not only not accurate.
Half.
It was half of what The Meg ended up making. Tracking said it was going to open $20 to $22 million. It opened with $45 million, more than doubling what it was expected to open. If we look at the top five, the number one, it was expected potentially to be a little competitive between Mission Impossible and The Meg. It was not. The Meg made $45 million. Mission Impossible just under $20 million. So a great start for The Meg. It made about $50 million in China. That's also a big deal, and we're going to talk about that after we get through the kind of this weekend's box office. We're going to talk about how much The Meg makes in China particularly is important to it. And also, even though it had such a big opening here in the United States, there's still a question because the budget on The Meg was so big. Even with that kind of an opening, is The Meg going to still be able to be a financial success? We're going to break that down right here, but after we get through everything that's going through this weekend.
Yeah, we're going to find out eventually over the next couple of months if there's time or space or desire for megalodons. Megalodon
versus you know what, anything else.
Anything else, any other giant thing, which there were more books in the series. The Meg is actually based on a series of books, if you guys did not know.
Yeah.
And there are more books and more story to tell,
Apparently
potentially, in this franchise. Number one shark movie, barring inflation. How do you feel about that as a Jaws lover?
As a Jaws lover, yes, it is the highest opening live action shark movie of all time. It is, however, beaten out by one shark movie that is of the animated variety. That is DreamWorks' Shark Tale, which I know everybody loves. Yeah, let's take a look at the top five shark openings. As I mentioned, The Meg just behind Shark Tale, but way ahead of the number two opening, which was Deep Blue Sea way back in 1999. I think even adjusting for inflation, Deep Blue Sea would probably still be below. Then The Shallows from a couple years ago. I don't know if you remember The Shallows.
I do. It was a good shark movie, actually.
I actually enjoyed The Shallows. And then at number five, still, not even adjusted for inflation, still at the number five spot, Jaws 3D, mainly because there aren't that many live action shark movies, one every 5 or so years, and they generally don't perform great at the box office. And if you're asking where Jaws was, it's because it came out number one in 1975 and number two on the way that all movies used to come out, which is a very gradual rollout. Yeah. It didn't have the massive opening weekend that you see in the summer now because it was of a different breed.
Yeah, it was a different era. In fact, it ushered in a whole new era of the blockbuster that was part of its legacy. Jaws 3D also boasted it was in 3D.
It was. Louis Gossett Jr. was in it.
It had a number of things. It was at a water park. It had a number of things going for it that probably helped boost it at the box office. But boy, The Meg sure didn't make money this weekend. But it wasn't the only thing that was there for us at the box office this weekend, and it's not the only success for Warner Brothers.
No, Warner Brothers. This was the best opening for Warner Brothers this year. But it's actually, if you look at the top five openings that the studio had this year, it kind of paints like this wonderful little smorgasbord of how you can do hits and flops in Hollywood today. Looking at the openings for Warner Brothers in 2018, The Meg, as I mentioned, is number one. Number two is Ready Player One, which opened $41.7 million. Now, that's an example of a movie that got off to a pretty good start here in the U.S., had a respectable gross, but was very reliant on overseas grosses to break even. As a matter of fact, we're going to look at Ready Player One and how much it made in a lot more detail later on. Ocean's 8, on the other hand, is a movie that did very well domestically. Its domestic and international gross is split about 50-50. It's a more modestly budgeted movie at about $70 million. So its gross of $280 million, even though it's going to be less than any of the other movies on that chart there, is very good because it had a lower budget and had a great domestic run. And then you look at movies like Rampage and Tomb Raider, which are both disappointing domestic grossers, but relied almost entirely on their international grosses in order to help try to make a profit. So looking at what Warner Brothers has done this year, what's worked and what hasn't worked, they've kind of been all over the map as far as domestic movies that did well domestically, movies that needed a lot of help internationally. Some of them pulled that off. Rampage, when you look at it at the end of the day, it's probably going to be able to eke out a profit once you bring in ancillaries, largely because it did better internationally than it did here. But The Meg is a case where we're going to have to wait and see the rest of those grosses to see what the true story on that movie is.
Warner Brothers is also in a really interesting position. And this is kind of heartening to see as we move into this era of like the idea of the super studio with Fox and Disney. And like, it does concern me in the sense of, I hate the idea of there's only one way to make a hit movie. And so actually I've been very impressed with sort of what they've done with smaller comedies and those that have broken out. And Warner Brothers does have a number of different approaches. They've also had a number of shakeups throughout the studio, one of which was the head of marketing. And people were really looking at her with an eye of judgment saying, you blew it with the Meg. You made a joke of your own movie. That's just going to backfire on you. Who's laughing now?
Exactly.
But the head of Warner Brothers that played fully into the idea that this was not a movie that was going to take itself too seriously. For critics, maybe it took itself a little bit too seriously.
In its own universe,
but
yes.
in its own universe. However, that approach in terms of the marketing to an audience was very, very successful. So well done, Warner Brothers. Hey, we probably have a happy Tom Cruise.
We do have a happy Tom Cruise. Looking at the top 5 again for this weekend, Mission Impossible, as I mentioned, stayed at number 2, dipped just under $20 million, but it held, it dropped 45% to stay in that number 2 spot, which is good. And more good news, when you look at how it's been doing day by day, its daily grosses, as far as where it is earned at this point in its run, have now surpassed Mission Impossible 2, which means that for the first time really in the last few days, Mission Impossible Fallout is now on track to be the highest grossing film of the franchise domestically. It's also continues to do well internationally. It has its eyes set on that goal of the most successful in the franchise, both domestically and worldwide. And the numbers are good even without China, which it gets at the end of this month. It comes out in China, and obviously star power, something that is a big draw at the Chinese box office, and the last Mission Impossible movie doing very well there. So Fallout is still in very good shape to become financially the most successful film in the Mission Impossible series, which is, as we mentioned in a few weeks before,
good news.
Very good news for Paramount, for Tom Cruise, for that franchise.
Yeah.
But also, where do they go from here?
Where do they go from here? It's good news for Paramount. We talk about this all the time. They needed this, so congratulations to them. But also good news for audiences that a movie that audiences and critics enjoyed does well. We like that. That means we get more good stuff.
That's a good thing. Yes.
Christopher Robin is pacing with Pete's Dragon.
Yeah, Christopher Robin continues to be pretty much point by point a good comparison with the live action remake of Pete's Dragon. It held about the same in its second week. It's in the number 3 spot. At number 4, a movie that has had a very long journey to the screen was Slender Man. It finished in 4th place with a D- cinema score, which means you are probably going to see that thing drop like a stone next week. And then at number 5 is BlacKkKlansman. This is Spike Lee's latest film. It opens in number 5, but if you look at the top 10 of all the movies in the top 10, it was playing on the fewest screens. It was in about 1,500 screens. Most of these movies were in 2,000, 2,500, 3,000 plus screens.
And it was only budgeted at about $11 million.
Yeah, it was a really, I mean, if you look budget for budget, it made its budget back this weekend. Now, of course, that doesn't account for production and P&A, promotion, advertising, all that stuff, which we'll also discuss with on the Blockbuster side in a second. But a good opening for Spike Lee. As a matter of fact, if you look at his career openings, his top 5, this was the 3rd best opening of his career, behind Original Kings of Comedy and Inside Man. And The Family Washington has been his good luck charm because accepting Original Kings of Comedy, Denzel and now his son, John David Washington, have been the leads in all of the other 4 movies that have been in his top 5. Of course, not all of Spike Lee's movies open wide on their opening weekend. A lot of them are smaller movies. They get limited release. But still, BlacKkKlansman, for it to open $10+ million in the summer season, great critical reviews, and a good cinema score. The audiences that saw it seemed to enjoy it. Yeah, A-. So the audiences that saw it also seem to enjoy it. We'll see how it does in the weeks coming up.
It's an interesting thing when we look at box office, because as you were just alluding to, what's considered a success is different per movie, right? And for this movie opening in these theaters, for Spike Lee at that budget, this is absolutely a success for him to be in the top 5 this week. I'm curious to see where it goes from here. Certainly, we're not even talking about the fact that BlacKkKlansman is very likely to get Oscar buzz in a number of different categories, and that could boost it as well. Looking good for that movie and for some more. And per screen is where we get into the little movies that could so much of the time.
And we keep this is like the second or third week in the last month or so where we've had this situation where I'm going to feature two movies because there were two that were within like tens of dollars of each other, mainly because these two movies were only playing on one screen, but they both had just over $18,000 per screen. The first one is a movie called Skate Kitchen. That took the title, but just barely. Well, you'll see how close the margin was. It's playing on one screen nationwide. It's the narrative feature debut of director and co-writer Crystal Moselle. It's about a group of young skateboarders in New York City. $18K on one screen, and it just beat out another movie from another filmmaker who both of these filmmakers were nominated in the Best of Next category at the Sundance Film Festival, a movie called Madeline's Madeline at $18,009 per screen. So literally like $50 less than Skate Kitchen. She's also a writer-director. It's about a theater, kind of a troubled theater production. Again, this is what I like to feature. Yes, they're on one. They're only playing on one screen. Both of these, I think, are unlikely probably to break out in the sense that even some of the limited release movies that we cover, like Lady Bird or The Big Sick, do. But I like to feature these movies when they play well on one screen because it might get a few more eyeballs on them.
Me too. Well, I'm definitely. I was actually already had Madeline's Madeline marked down to go see. I watched the trailer. And I actually, if you guys have watched the trailer, I will say that the trailer didn't hugely speak to me. But I say that adding that everyone I know that has seen the movie loved it. So let's all go see it. Why not?
I went and saw last week's Champion, The Miseducation of Cameron Post.
Which was gorgeous.
And I quite enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I liked that film. So I that's why I like to feature the per-screen averages, because a lot of these movies are worth your attention if you can find them, which is very difficult to do a lot. Sometimes you have to wait till they're on Amazon or iTunes or somewhere where you can rent or buy them. But the good news for that is a lot of these smaller movies, the window is much shorter. Yeah. So if you don't see some of these movies playing near you, it's more than likely that they're available to buy or rent at home much more quickly than they would be for a major studio release.
And we'll do our best to remind you to do so when we see it there as well. Okay, so let's talk about, they opened the door, and this is not a spoiler because you would imagine this is true. They opened the door in the text of the Meg for a potential sequel, right? Will we see that sequel? Dan Murrell, tell us about the dollars and cents.
Well, this is the question that people are asking. They were really asking it last week when it looked like the Meg was going to open to about $20 or $25 million. Of course, it blew that opening out of the water, but people are still wondering, and the question is the Meg, even though it opened at number one, going to be a financial success? And the real reason why they're asking this question is that it carries a huge budget. It's been reported, some people report it at about $180 million.
I read
Warner
200.
Brothers, yes, some people say 200. Warner Brothers says it's $130 million. But
do you believe the studio?
I don't believe the studio, but I'm going to split the difference and say, let's say $155 million budget.
Okay.
The other thing that you have to add on, especially for one of these big releases, is promotion and advertising. As you mentioned, the Meg had a very aggressive advertising campaign. I found a report that said that they spent about $140 million on promotion and advertising for this, which wouldn't surprise me for the amount of billboards and advertisements, TV, trailers,
stand-ups.
The stand-ups that were in theaters, the activation. They did a lot of activations, social posts, stuff like that.
There was a VR experience. There was just a number of arms to this marketing.
They're really pushing that heavily. So if you take those numbers, that means that Warner Brothers is looking at a potential investment of around $280 to $300 million in this movie, which is why people are saying, even though it opened well, is it going to make money? Now, there has been some reports that there's a break even for this movie around $400 million, which is worldwide, not domestic, worldwide. And I think a lot of people might say, like, well, if they spent $280, $300 million, then how is it going to break even if it makes $400 million? And I think a large part of the answer to that question is that the Meg is the first in a series of co-productions. Warner Brothers entered a deal. It's called Flagship Entertainment. It's basically a pact that they made with China Media Capital and a company called TVB back in 2015 to make a bunch of co-productions, most of them in the Chinese language, but the first big one was the Meg. 3 years later, we now have the first one. What does that benefit Warner Brothers? We've talked about how lucrative the Chinese box office is. reportedly most
Bigger bite.
features, bigger bite, much bigger bite. The Meg opened bigger in China this weekend than it did here in the United States. What the advantage that Warner Brothers has with the movie doing well in China is, the research that I found is that the standard cut that a studio gets for from the Chinese box office is 25 to 27%, which is not a whole lot. It's a little less even than the standard cut that you'll read from a lot of international markets. The Chinese box office, they take a huge chunk of that money. Because Warner Brothers is in this co-financing deal, they get reportedly 43% of the Chinese box office, which means if the movie overperforms and does really, really well in China, they are going to get a bigger chunk of that money. So that's why I think the break-even point for the Meg is around $400 million, because they get a bigger chunk of what's probably going to be either the second most or the most lucrative market in the entire world. But I mentioned talking about Ready Player One because a lot of people have asked us, how does this work? How does a movie make money? How does a movie break even? And so I wanted to kind of break down a movie like Ready Player One. I mentioned the fact that it did pretty good domestically. It did better internationally, and how that can help a movie. So bear with me. I didn't have time to, I feel like Doc Brown in Back to the Future, I didn't have time to paint or build it to scale. I didn't have time to make charts for this part, but I wanted to kind of break down Ready Player One's performance and what that means for the movie and how much money it could potentially make. Ready Player One is kind of similar to the Meg. It actually cost a little bit more. It had a reported budget of $175 million and an advertising budget of about $150 million. So, you know, if those numbers are to be believed, Warner Brothers put in about $325 million into Ready Player One, which is a huge investment.
Sure.
If you look at how much it did, it made $137 million domestically. Generally, the rule is that a movie's going to take 50 to 55% of the domestic box office goes back to the studios. A bigger chunk at the beginning, a smaller chunk at the end. More goes to the theaters the longer that it plays.
It's different depending on the market.
Exactly.
There's a number of factors that go into it, but roughly that.
Roughly 50 to 55%. So let's say half of the domestic goes back to the studio. That's $68.5 million.
Different if you're Disney.
It is different if you're Disney. You've got guarantees.
Yes.
The Disney's on its own plane.
Yes, they are.
Ready Player One made $445 million internationally. Again, the percentage that a studio gets back varies from country to country, but the general rule of thumb that I found is that you can count on about a third of the international market coming back to the studio. So looking at what Ready Player One made internationally, $445 million, about $146.8 million of that comes back to the studios. So you're looking at, just from the theatrical release, about $215 million coming back to the studio from Ready Player One. Well, it costs $325 million, so I think most people would say, well, you're about $110 million short, so the movie was a flop. That's not necessarily true, because the other thing that you have to factor in is, number one, streaming, Blu-ray, home. That's going to be a pretty good chunk of change. And then increasingly, where you really get a lot of money is you sell the rights to TV or Netflix or wherever it is.
Airplanes, wherever.
Ancillary
distribution.
There was some merchandising that was done for Ready Player One.
And I wouldn't be surprised if we see a merchandising pop with some of the kitschy sort of phrasing for the Meg. I would buy that T-shirt.
Yeah. I agree. I think that, you know, when a movie pops like the Meg may potentially pop, there is some ancillary benefits. So I think when you look at Ready Player One as a whole, the reason that most people consider it a hit is that, yes, even though its theatrical numbers fell about $110 million short of its budget, once you put all of the ancillaries back into that pot, home media and TV rights and merchandising are going to add up to more than $110 million. And that's the magic number, and that's what you get and how you become profitable. So looking at the Meg, it's got a good start. Warner Brothers has the advantage of having a bigger bite of the Chinese box office, no pun intended. It really is going to depend, and it's like a broken record, but the Meg legs are what is going to be important to this movie, because that's what it needs to do is
mega legs.
It needs to have great legs here in the U.S. to get some of that 50% domestic back. It needs to keep doing well in China to get that extra piece of the profit back to the studio, and that's what's going to really write the story on the Meg. So that was my attempt to sort of get to the bottom of what is a very convoluted, and that's not even accounting for creative accounting, which is a whole other thing.
Creative accounting real quick, if someone could just either draw or Photoshop the shark with some legs, I would be so appreciative.
Meg legs, yes.
Meg legs, and tweet that to us. But yeah, the creative accounting is usually for the the members of the production that had points, and the studio doesn't want to give them as much money as they owe them, and so they get a little creative and say they were less profitable than they really were in order to cut people out of all of their dollars and cents. And if you're AMC and doing that, eventually you get sued a lot of times. Okay,
there you go.
So it'll be an interesting thing to see play out over the long run, because it's also, I think people are wondering how many more Megs might we see. Like I said, there's a series of books for them to draw on, and they also did open the door, not actually as overtly as I thought they were going to.
They didn't really set
subtle.
up. Yeah, it was very subtle. They didn't set up a sequel like here we go again,
right.
like they might have done.
And it was actually earlier in the movie that they opened the door rather than like in the post credits where they just like zoom, pan across and there's another shark.
Yeah.
Spoilers for the Meg. You're fine.
Was that in the Meg? I left.
You left.
Was there a credit
No,
scene?
there wasn't.
Oh, there wasn't. Okay.
I'm saying I was.
They could have done that.
I
yes.
was surprised to some degree that they weren't that confident.
Yes.
But you know what? Well done them, because you shouldn't do that.
Yeah, it's really embarrassing if you can't follow through.
Exactly. The summer movie report is coming to a close in the next couple of weeks.
We're in August, Ross. We're in the second week of August, which means the summer movie report is coming to a close. The same 10 movies are on there. However, if history holds, the Meg opened to $45 million. Looking at the cinema score, which was a B+, that's good, not great, but good. Looking at the kind of multiple that score usually generates, it's looking likely, or at least very possible, that the Meg is going to jump onto this top 10. Mission Impossible keeps on climbing the chart. The question is the Meg going to knock out Mamma Mia? Is the shark going to eat Meryl Streep,
or
which would
even
be a
the
great
ocean
movie on its own?
Will it take out the Ocean's 8?
Well, take out Ocean's 8. That's true. But Mamma Mia is the one in the most vulnerable position. If you look at the trends and what the multiples that an opening like the Meg usually delivers, it's very, very possible that I lose my perfect season and that the Meg chomps Mamma Mia out of there. But you never know, Roth. Plus, you never know if there's another movie that's going to bubble up and maybe take out Ocean's 8 or even more on that chart. So we'll just have to see how the Meg does in the weeks moving forward.
We have Crazy Rich Asians opening this weekend. It's currently tracking at about 18 to 20.
And it's doing the weird thing, but it's doing the kind of unique move of opening early. It opens on Wednesday, I think, because they want it to sort of generate a little buzz. First Purge did that too, going into the July 4th weekend. I think they're trying to look for word of mouth to sort of roll into Friday, which is a calculated risk, because if you have a great movie that can really pay off, because people might see it on Wednesday and Thursday night and it rolls into the weekend. However, if the response is not good, you could really be damaging your chances with the opening. So we'll see what the word of mouth is. The reviews so far have been very positive.
We are going to be reviewing it this week.
We are indeed.
We are delighted and excited. I am delighted and excited. I guess I won't speak for you to be seeing it tonight. I assume you are too.
I am indeed.
And it certainly is appealing to it has a little bit of an open field, because rom-coms right now are kind of the domain of Netflix. Like, Netflix sort of owns that market at the moment. So in theaters, we don't have a lot of them.
No,
we really don't. So maybe that'll help out.
Maybe.
Domestic chart.
Domestically, I talked about this last week. Ocean's 8 and Ready Player One, two movies we just mentioned on Warner Brothers list this year, got knocked out of the top 10 in favor of Mission Impossible Fallout and Hotel Transylvania 3. I don't think both of these are going to end the year. Hotel Transylvania 3 definitely will not. But for now, they have jumped not only onto the summer list, but they're now on the domestic U.S. list for the year. And worldwide, there's not a whole lot going on in the worldwide chart.
But Incredibles 2
hit a milestone. It is now officially the highest grossing Pixar movie of all time worldwide. It passes Toy Story 3. Ant-Man and the Wasp is there. I suspect, looking at how Mission Impossible has done the last few weeks, I have a hunch that this is the last week that Ant-Man and the Wasp will be on the worldwide top 10, but you never know. It could climb up, jockey up. Mission Impossible, though, when it hits that Chinese opening, is definitely going to jump up that list, I think, significantly. But for now, Ant-Man and the Wasp chilling out there at number 10 for another week.
For another little movie. I mean, it's not.
It is a little movie. They're little heroes.
I know. Big movie, little heroes.
Yes.
It's hanging on. It's hanging on.
It's hanging in there.
It's hanging in there.
$500 million, I'll take it.
Yeah.
Why not?
We'll see if Disney will take it.
We'll see if Disney does. Yeah.
Opening this week, like we said.
Crazy Rich Asians, Alpha.
Yeah.
Which is an August. Well, it's got a kind of an August relief or release vibe about it. And then Mark Wahlberg. I swear, him and Peter Berg make like one movie every 3 months. It's another Mark Wahlberg, Peter Berg movie called Mile 22, which is coming out this weekend. I think I'm going to get to see that on Wednesday night. The embargo goes up on Thursday, I think.
So
check it out and see if it's, it might be like a couple other movies. I see it and I'm like, hey, people should go see that.
Why not?
You never know. But yeah, Mark Wahlberg and Peter Berg, it's like they make 3 movies a year. It's crazy.
I like that Peter Berg, but I don't always like...
Mark Wahlberg?
No, his movies.
Oh.
I mean, Peter Berg for me is very hit and miss,
He's very prolific, though.
He sure is. He makes a lot of movies.
He's like the most under-the-radar prolific director, one of them working right now.
Yeah. And you know what we talked about earlier today? There's almost no one in the world that is always good at what they do.
There really isn't. We were trying to compare
isn't.
notes, like who is consistently always really good. And it's like the one name we came up with is Denis Villeneuve, but he's done like... 4 movies, yeah.
So there you go. It's a very tough job. So everybody gets a little bit of leeway. I think in general terms, that's a message we can leave ourselves with today.
Cut them some
slack. Give each other a break. Just give each other a break. Good box officing with you, Dan.
Thanks. I'm out of numbers.
Yeah.
I got no more.
We'll be back next week with many more numbers.